Let's date forever. Here's your weekly dose of relationship fuel with Sammy and Nathan Yeager. Hello and welcome to Date Forever. In this week's episode, we're chatting about rebuilding a relationship after infidelity, how our friends and family can influence our relationship, and getting comfortable with vulnerability, and how it can unlock deeper connection. But before we dive into that, Sammy, what's been fueling you up this week?
I had a very big and full week last week. I had a little trip to Melbourne for a work getaway for a couple of days. And then I had a couple of really big meetings as we're rapidly moving towards the end of 2022. And then you and I had our annual game plan day over the weekend.
Yeah, we did.
So lots of those kind of things fueled me up. But amongst all of that, this is probably the anti-fuel up, is that you weren't really all that well this week.
No, I wasn't. So what fueled me up was having some time to be able to do that. So we didn't actually have anything planned this weekend other than to do our annual game plan. So it did allow a little bit of space for me to recover from my sickness.
Yeah, so if you've listened to the show before, you will have heard us talk about our annual game plan, but basically we take 1 or 2 days out of the year, generally right at the end of November or beginning of December, to plan our next 365 days. We review the year that was and then set some intentions for the following year and create some goals. So we didn't quite make it through our whole agenda with Nath being not his usual sharpest self. But that was my fuel up, really reflecting on the year that was, recognizing how much we've achieved. We got down into the nitty gritty of some of our big lifetime goals, particularly some of our financial goals, and how are we going to do this? Where is this going to come from? And what areas do we need to grow in to make that happen? So yeah, I really enjoyed spending the day with you, having those big conversations. What about you, Nath? What fueled you up other than being nursed on by your wife?
Yeah, that was really nice. And thank you so much for doing that. But yeah, our annual game plan was really what fueled me up. And like you touched on, it's all good to have the goals, but it's not all that helpful if you don't have a plan to get there. So that was really what fueled me up, was starting to map out some of what the plan is to achieve some of our big financial goals and some of the lifestyle features as well that we really want to embed into our life. So this is really just about designing the life that we want to have and that we want to evolve into, rather than just going by default. Yeah, it was really exciting. And like you said too, really nice to reflect back on the previous year and see some of the stuff that we've achieved over the last year.
Yeah, and if you are interested in our annual game plan agenda, what we do, we actually have a podcast episode all about it where we talk specifically through the agenda, the questions that we ask, how we do it. So just go and have a look. So the episode was launched in January 2021, and it's called Making Your Annual Game Plan for a Better Relationship with Sammy and Nathan Yeager.
So go on and check that out. But in the meantime, here's this week's guest.
Today we have Dana Shea joining us. She's a marriage and relationship coach and host of the podcast Real Relationship Talk. She's been married for 23 years and is the mum of 4 fabulous kids, 2 adults and 2 teenagers. Dana's love is to help connect disconnected couples and show them how to love each other again. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Sammy and Nathan. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you guys today.
Thank you. Hey, so anyone who ends up in the relationship space, we know has a story, has had a moment of wow, other people now need to know what I've just learned. So tell us a little bit about your story. How did you end up in the relationship space?
Well, I got married super young. I was 18. My husband was 21. We've known each other since we were little kids, 5 years old.
Wow.
So we got married super young and we didn't know anything. You think you know everything when you're 18, but you don't know anything. And so we just started experiencing pretty much immediately, problems in our marriage. We have a whole story of how we overcame infidelity in our marriage. And one of the things that we realized is we knew we needed we didn't call them coaches back then, but we were really looking for mentors or just somebody who could kind of help us and show us the ropes. There were no podcasts back then, and so we were just trying to reach out to people. And when people would hear kind of what we're going through, they would either act like we had 3 heads, oh my, or they would just shun us. And so we said what we want to be to people, what we never had. And so fast forward 10, 15 years, I kind of started organically coaching people. Didn't even know that that was what I was doing. I was just kind of helping people along. And then I realized I'm saying the same thing to the same, you know what I mean? The same thing to different couples. So how can I actually package this better? And so there was Real Relationship Talk kind of birthed as a marriage coach. I coached for a while, and then the podcast came along after that.
Yeah, wow. I think that's so interesting, like to pioneer having some of those conversations with people, even if it's in an informal capacity, like looking for a mentor or getting curious about the people that you know in your life. Like, hey, like tell me a little bit about how you make your relationship work. Like, I imagine that even now that's quite a vulnerable conversation or question to ask someone in your network. But I imagine even 20 years ago, that was very much a weird thing to ask.
Absolutely. And I think the thing is, people, I'm in the Christian space. So, you know, a lot of Christians, and this is not to knock any, you know, not to knock any Christian, but a lot of times I think people would feel like I should be better than where I'm at. Right. So they would feel like we're having these problems in our marriage, but we shouldn't be. So therefore, we're never going to talk about them. But the thing that the reason that that's not good is because you have people like me that I'm like 19, 20 years old at the time, like, help me, help me. And when people aren't willing to share, then I walk away unhelped, and then they walk away not feeling like they can actually be themselves. And so, like we were kind of joking before we started recording. I said, "Oh, I always overshare," and I do. Like, there'll be so many conversations that after I'm talking to someone, I'm like, I should not have told them that story. But then they'll come back later and they're like, thank you so much for being real. The reason that I call the podcast Real Relationship Talk isn't because I'm real, but it's that like everyone was saying that, like, thank you for being real. Thank you for being transparent. Thank you for being authentic with your story. And I just think that that's so important that when we are helping others in their relationships, we understand that our relationship is going to come under some microscopic scrutiny, and we have to be able and willing to be more vulnerable and transparent about the things that we've walked through.
Yeah, definitely. And I know that was one of the reasons for us trying to start our podcast as well, was because that, like, even though on the surface you might see a couple and go, oh, they've got a really great relationship, but really you don't actually know what's happening behind closed doors and how they're actually making it work, like, in the background. So just being like open and vulnerable to even start discussing, like, oh, how do you actually do these things? Because on the surface, you kind of seem to have it together, but what's actually going on in the background? Because it's kind of like the tip of the iceberg thing, I think. What you're actually seeing on the surface and from the outside is probably only 10% of what's actually going on in a relationship.
I had a real tipping point around this kind of stuff. A few years ago, one of my best friends in the whole world came to me and told me that she was separating from her husband. And after she had said that thing, then she shared all of the things that have been going wrong, all of the things that they'd been struggling with, all of the things that were really hard, all of the things that they'd tried. And I was like, I was in your wedding. Like, we see you fairly regularly. We have conversations like as friends. And she'd never shared any of that with me. And it really held up a mirror for me to go, well, I have this expectation of my friend. And I thought I had created a safe place where she felt that she could bring those things. But obviously that was not true. And I really reflected on, well, am I sharing when my relationship is not in a good place, when I'm really struggling, and not just in our romantic relationship, mine and Nate's romantic relationship, but am I sharing when I'm struggling in any of my relationships? And the answer was no. I was like, I'm probably sharing the very tip of the iceberg. So that was a real invitation for me and a moment of growth of like, okay, I want my friends to be open and vulnerable about what they're finding hard. So I need to do more of that. I need to lead with more of that. That was a real turning point for me. And I know that since then, it's probably about 5 years ago now, maybe even a little longer, that the depth of my friendships is far greater. And it was surprising almost how much as I started to let my walls down a little bit and let friends further into my life and my relationship, the inner workings of my relationship, that how frequently that was echoed back of like, oh, we had that experience, or we had a similar thing, or, oh, that's really, I'm sorry to hear that, or whatever the thing might be. Hey, have you tried ABC? We did that and this is how we solved it, or started recommending tools and resources. And when Nathan and I started talking about launching the podcast, that was one of the things. It was like, how can we remove some of the stigma, heaviness around relationships and talking about what's working and what's not, and removing the like any kind of judgment or shame about asking for help and asking for information.
Yeah, I think you hit it right on the nail. It's the shame. I have a
Mm.
very similar story with my best friend who was also going through a divorce, and we're best friends. You know what I mean? Like, that's something that I knew that there were issues, but I didn't know about, like, the divorce. And we had a conversation, just kind of like hey, let's get real with each other. Like, why didn't I know about this sooner? And her response to me was, she said, I thought you were going to judge me. And that broke my heart because I am
Mm.
not judgmental. I felt like, wow, did I portray something, or do I have a blind spot maybe that I don't know about, that my friend thought that she wouldn't receive love and understanding and acceptance and empathy from me, that she would receive judgment from me. And so that was a really important conversation for our friendship, but it was also an important conversation for me, not just in marriage coaching, but just in being a human. Am I creating, like you said, Sammy, am I creating a safe space for people to feel like they can talk? But then the other side of that is sometimes people are dealing with their own shame and their own issues, that even if you try to create the safest space ever, they're still going to be held hostage by their own feelings of, my relationships is bad. Or this is why a lot of times I do talk so much about my own relationship, because I want to normalize things that couples go through. My husband and I have been married for 23 years. It has not been like peaches and cream and a bed of roses the whole time. Like, you're going to have ups and downs, hills and valleys. There's going to be, I did a whole talk on how to love your spouse when you don't like your spouse. Like, that's real. Like, you're going to wake up some days and be like, ew, you know, why did I choose you? And they're probably going to think the same thing about you. And like, when we can't have those honest conversations, then people start to think like, that's when the shame comes in. Like, oh, I shouldn't feel this way. I used to think nobody else's marriage has these problems. Nobody else's marriage is going through that. But then when we're willing to have like open and honest conversations, you realize, oh, I'm really normal. Like, lots of marriages go through these things.
Yeah. And that's so interesting too, that you had such a similar experience with your friend. And maybe hopefully we're, with Brene Brown's work around vulnerability, that we are learning that it's okay and it is the pathway to deeper, more meaningful relationships. But they're not, just because we know that, or we're starting to really know and understand that, doesn't make that easy to go, hey, look at this wound that I have. Do you want to take a close look at it? Like, you want to inspect it. And
shit's a bit
that's
shit right now.
Yeah, that's a hard thing to do. And I want to acknowledge that, like, just because we say that, like, hey, go and share your baggage with your friends or even with your partner, like, doesn't necessarily mean that you'd be like, oh, I just instinctively now know how to do that or know how to start that conversation when we've never had those types of conversations in this relationship before. So as a relationship coach, do you have any insight on how we lead to deeper, more meaningful, more vulnerable conversations, either with our closest, nearest and dearest friends or romantic partner?
I think that laying the groundwork for, before you kind of have like the big conversation about like, here are all of my insides, these are all my inners, feel free to kind of pick them apart. Then I think like starting small, maybe like, let's say, for example, there's a couple who they're going through marriage stuff, right? Or relationship stuff. And they really do want to confide in a friend, but they're not really sure if that's a safe space. They're not really sure how that friend will respond. Start with something else that's maybe vulnerable. For example, what did you think about the latest thing that happened in the world politically, right? Like, that's an area of vulnerability, because nowadays it's like, if you say one thing that disagrees with the other person or party or whatever, it's like you're canceled. So can you maybe start with something that's not about your relationship, or maybe start with something that maybe is like a parenting fail, or something that is kind of testing the waters a little bit, because I do believe that you need to be discerning about who you share your heart with. Everyone doesn't deserve that type of access, even if they're a friend. And some people can't handle that. So being wise too, like, have you ever heard that friend share things with you about another friend that was deeply personal? If so, you probably don't want to share that with that friend, because your business is going to end up getting back out to somebody else. So I think if you kind of look at, okay, is this person like worthy, and not like worthy like as a human being, but are they worthy of receiving my heart? Are they worthy of me sharing and opening myself up to them? If the answer is yes, then start small. Start with something else that's not necessarily like the big thing. And then if they handle that well, then you just got to kind of jump into the deep waters and say, listen, you know what? My husband and I, or my boyfriend, whoever, we've been really struggling in this area, and I really need somebody to talk to. I would love if I could talk to you about this, and go from there.
Yeah. I like what you shared there about the access and friendships, because I'm a really visual person, so this helps me a lot. But I often imagine that my life or me as a really awesome musician or band on the stage, and then you've got like the side of the people who are on the stage with you, the people who are side of stage in the very fancy, right there with you but to the wings, and then you've got the people who are like, you know, just out front, general admission, and then you've got the people who are way out back in the concert. And I think about, like, sometimes I've definitely got that wrong, and I've shared things with people who were not on the stage with me but were way out back at the concert, and that wasn't the right thing to share with that depth of relationship, and vice versa. There's been times where I've moved people from my side of stage back into general admission, or vice versa. And I'm not having a breakup conversation with them and be like, hey, by the way, in my brain I used to categorize you as this and now I categorize you as that.
I'm taking this ticket away from you.
Yeah.
Right.
Here's a GA.
Ticket cancelled. Here's a new one.
Yeah.
No, I'm not doing that. It's more just how I think about my inner circle, who's in that inner circle, and I'm very protective of that. But the same, like, often when people have moved from that real on stage with me or in the wings sort of relationship, it's because they have lacked the willingness to have vulnerable, open conversations. And for me, that's incredibly important in my relationships. Like, the people that I want to hold close to me want to go through those conversations. They want to grow. They want to see their blind spots. They want to go, hey, Sammy, can I give you some feedback? I just noticed X, Y, Z, or over the last whatever. I want those people in my life. So often as I've moved people to, back to general admission or further, the nosebleed section, it's because of, misalignment in those desires in a relationship. And I think that's totally okay too.
I love that analogy. I'm going to use that. I'm totally stealing that analogy. I'm not a musician, but that is so awesome. I love the visual of, like, kind of who's on stage with you and then the nosebleed section. We actually used to, my husband and I, we led a small group in our house for 5 years of other couples. And, like, everyone's like, okay, group dynamics is when you first get a group together, you're going to kind of have to test the waters a little bit and build trust in small areas. And I've been a part of many groups like that. This group was not that. This group was like, on the first day, people were like, let's jump into 35 feet. Like, they were just like, blah, 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 blah. And it was such, like, you could tell everybody in that group, all of those couples have been yearning for the same thing. They wanted that deep, authentic. So it's so weird because none of us even knew each other. You know, like, we knew, some of us were acquaintances, and then some of them I had never seen before until they showed up in my living room. And so that group was so special. It was so important. But we had this one couple who came along a little bit after. And I don't know if it was because we had already established such a tight bond, but this couple came in and they would not share, right? Like, they would go around and they would kind of nod, and they were a part of the conversation, but they never really, like, talked about their stuff. And what happened is that created a distrust in the group. Like, nobody trusted them. And so then the vulnerability that we had, it started kind of waning a little bit. So I had to literally, like, kind of meet with that couple and say, hey guys, like, if you want to be a part of this group, you're going to have to open up and share. If you don't feel comfortable with that, this probably isn't the group for you. And so I think that sometimes we don't realize that when we don't open up and share our lives, we are creating a distrust with others, because people are like, wait a minute, like, and we were sharing some deeply personal things. And it's like, hey, we're trusting you in this small environment to handle this, but you're not trusting us to handle what's going on in your life. So they got moved to the nosebleed section for sure. I think we actually put them out of the arena, actually.
And some people should be out of the arena. And I think, like, sometimes we do get confused with, like, nosebleed section, probably like the things that you post on Facebook or social media. So I've definitely got friends who have confused the nosebleed section and what they share on Facebook to the what should really be
side of stage
or on stage with you. And I think that's it can be a hard thing to learn, to moderate all of those kinds of things. But I want to ask you, you said that it sounded like these couples were, like, really yearning for an opportunity to connect with other couples and have those deep, vulnerable conversations with other couples who are having similar or have had similar experiences. What kind of role do you think our wider relationships and networks and, you know, our peers and the couples that we hang out with play in influencing our relationship?
Oh, huge. Oh my goodness, huge. I think that we are way more influenced than we realize for the positive or the negative. So I, for example, am my closest friends, one is divorced, the one that I talked about earlier, and then the other two have really solid marriages. So these are like my people that I can talk to about anything.
They're
Now,
on stage with you.
exactly. They are right there, right? And so there are other people in my life that, not that like if you're single, you can't be my friend, but I do have, I mean, what if I'm going through something and I'm talking to somebody who's never been married, like they can support, but they can't hold that because they don't have that same experience. And so I think that we do have to be very careful about our influences because the way that people influence us a lot of times is subconscious. So for example, I would talk to couples, and this is before I really like got into coaching as a business. This is when I was still kind of organically coaching couples, and I would talk to them, and then I would realize like when I got home, I had an attitude with my husband. And he was like, I didn't do anything to you. You know what I mean? But I was being influenced by everything that I'm hearing and all of this stuff that all of these couples were going through. And so if you kind of parse that out a little bit more, if all of your friends are having horrible, terrible relationships, that is going to influence you. You're going to start fights in your marriage or relationship that really don't have anything to do with your partner, but because this is like the noise that you're hearing. It's like if you, we're all like in a store and a song comes on and we like are singing the song and we're like, I don't even know that song. Like where did that come from? But it's like the background noise that plays in our mind that we don't even pick up on. And that's why it's so important that you are really selective of who your inner circle is and then the information that they're giving to you and that you're giving out. And so when I look at my influence, and this isn't just like I'm thinking of like my closest friends, but even kind of that next layer, I'm like, okay, how do I want to replicate what I'm seeing in their marriages? Or do I want to replicate what I'm seeing in their relationships? If I don't, then there's a little bit of a pause there. You know, not that we can't be acquaintances. Sure, we can go out for coffee, we can laugh it up, but super, super close because I don't want to replicate that in my own relationship.
I think what you mentioned there is super powerful. And I think it's something that a lot of people underestimate is like how influential their peer group is on them. And I guess that's the thing. Like if you see all of your peer group around you and when they hit turbulence in their relationships, they're like, no, we're just calling it quits. We're getting out. We're getting divorced. Then if you're hit a hurdle as well, then what are you going to do? You're probably going to do the same thing that everyone else in your peer group has done and just decide to call it quits and get a divorce. Whereas yeah, if you have seen people around you that are working and putting in the effort and getting the coaching and doing all those sorts of things, then you're definitely going to at least try that first and see what you can do to try and, yeah, overcome some of those challenges.
Yeah. And if I can just be like really honest, when my husband and I were kind of going through infidelity in our relationship, most of my husband's friends were cheaters. And it was like, no wonder he couldn't like get it together. Like all the people, your closest folks around you are not only like reinforcing your behavior, but they're also doing it too. And so the major change I think happened, lots of things happened leading up to us being able to restore our relationship. But one of those things was like he had to cut away a lot of those folks. And it's not that they're horrible people. It's not that we're not judging them, but like that's not where I'm headed in my life because then again he's hanging out with them. Where do they want to go? Well, they don't want to hang out in places that are conducive for a healthy marriage, put it that way. So I think people need to be aware of like the people around you. They are influencing you. We talk to our teenagers about this all the time, right? But then sometimes as adults we forget it's not just peer pressure. Like when you're a teenager, we're all still being affected by peer pressure even as adults.
Can you talk to us a little bit about your experience with infidelity and coming back from that? Do you feel that your relationship is the same, better, stronger, worse after experiencing that within your marriage?
It's so much better. I mean, of course, I would never want anybody to go through that because it's deeply painful. It's embarrassing. It's humiliating. It's all the things. But I realized that my husband and I, you know, because we got married so young, we had built our marriage on a shaky foundation. And when we started really having challenges, that foundation was not strong enough to hold. And so we had to go through that. Now, I don't want to go through that ever again, but I realized that going through that situation, it made me more aware of myself, my weaknesses, where I had dropped the ball, things that I had allowed in my marriage, from things that just happened to me as a child, or kind of growing up in a house where my mother was an amazing mother. I love my mother to death, but my mom was an enabler. And I didn't know that about myself. Like, that had actually transferred over to me until I went through this whole situation. And I'm like, whoa, hold up now. So I learned so much about myself. I learned about grace. I learned about forgiveness. I learned about grieving. Sometimes we talk about grief as like someone died, but we all go through grief in our relationships. And unfortunately, we're not really taught how to grieve well, like how to like just sit with that loss, that there was a betrayal. Like, that's a big deal. And so to be able to go through that. So we are many, many years removed from that. And the truth is that there's still some scars. You know what I mean? Like, there's still times that we were traveling. I was at a conference last week, and we were traveling through a city. I wasn't with my husband. I was with someone, another group of people. We were traveling through a city where my husband had gone several times to things would happen in that city. And it was like, ooh, like, I hadn't been in that city for a decade. And then I was like, oh, that was a scar. But thankfully, it didn't burn anymore. It's not oozing still. So I know that there's been healing from that. But when people hear our story and they're like, oh my gosh, like, how did you guys recover? I'm like, we're still recovering. We'll probably always be in recovery mode. Not that, again, we're not gaping wounds recovering, but it's something that we talk about it. A lot of what I do as a coach is helping couples to overcome infidelity. So I always just tell people, if that has happened to you, just be prepared for a very, very long journey to restoration. It's not something that you can just say, oh, well, that happened. Okay, well, I forgive you. Let's move on. There's so much to unpack, and there's so much that has to be healed and rebuilt, and new priorities put in place, new friendships, like I said, put in place, new boundaries put in place. There's lots of work that has to happen for a marriage to be able to recover from something like that.
Yeah. Esther Perel talks about this idea that it used to be incredibly shameful to get divorced and leave a marriage from infidelity. And now it's almost as if the shame has flipped the other way. It's like, well, you can leave. Why aren't you leaving? Once a cheater, always a cheater, that kind of dialogue. So can you talk to me a little bit about how you arrived at the decision to stay? Did you just know you were going to stay, or was there a real crossroad?
Oh, there was absolutely a crossroads. So my husband and I both cheated on one another. So it was interesting because, again, and not to make an excuse, but I was 19 years old when my situation happened. And I felt incredibly remorseful right away. Like, it wasn't like a long-term thing that I kept going on and on. Like, it literally, in my situation, happened one time. I was completely devastated, never looked back. That relationship ended that night. Where my husband had more of a longer journey to his epiphany of like, oh, this isn't how marriage should work here. And so there was, for me at least, a lot of that back and forth. Like, am I stupid? Like, am I really like the dumbest person ever to still be in this relationship? That's what I would think. I had children. So then it was like, okay, do I stay just because of my kids? But then if I leave, what's going to happen to my kids? So there's all of these conflicting emotions. And then on top of that, I'm a Christian and I believe that God loves marriage, and I'm like, but then again, he doesn't want me to be in this crazy dysfunctional marriage. There was all kinds of emotions all over the place. And so I remember getting to a place, and it wasn't like my husband was like just cheating on me for like years and years. We would have cycles, we would have like years of just wonderful, healthy marriage. We'd be working on stuff, and then I'd find out something. And I'm like, you know what? So I got to the point, we were probably 8 years, 9 years into our marriage. And I said, you know what? I just don't want to live like this anymore. Like, I don't want to go into my 30s still dealing with this stuff that I've been dealing with in my 20s. And so I got to a point where I was like, okay, I'm going to leave. And at that point, it had always been me trying to tell my husband to leave. I'm like, you need to leave. This isn't right. You need to go. And he never wanted a divorce. He never wanted to separate. He was always like, we can fix it. Let's work it out. Let's work it out. And then it got to a point where I was like, I'm going to leave. And I'd never said that before, ever in our relationship. And so I think he was like, whoa, like, wait a minute. And I had been trying to get him to go to counseling, and he would go for like a session or two and nothing really concrete. I was doing all the work. I was going to the conferences, reading the books. I'm like, wait, why am I doing all this work? And so I just kind of had this moment where I was like, you know what? I'm released from this. I can go. And so it was when I made that decision. My husband tells it this way. He says, when Dana took her hands off of it and she basically was like, I'm done. That's kind of when he had his light bulb moment, because I wasn't trying to do all the things to fix the marriage myself. I realized I cannot fix him. Like, he has to figure out whatever he needs to figure out to work on himself, and I just let it go. And then I don't know, I wish I could say, like, oh, it was 3 months later. I don't know the timeline, but very shortly after that, I started noticing changes in my husband. Primarily, he started going to counseling and paying out of pocket for this very expensive counselor. And when I saw him like investing money, I was like, but I didn't trust it, to be honest, because he would do these things, right? He would see like, oh, I'm in the doghouse. So he would, like, do a little bit of good for a while and then fall back into his pattern. So when I would see, okay, he's going to counseling, I was like, okay, well, that's good. Let's see how long it lasts. And then he just kept going and he kept going and he kept going. And then he started changing his friendships. And I was like, okay. He started doing these things that I started to see, okay, he's serious about this. So I remember, I will never forget it. I was literally in my bathroom and I prayed and I was like, I don't know what to do. And I really felt like, and I don't say this often, like, well, God said, but I really felt like God said to me, if you stay, I'll bless you. If you leave, I'll bless you. And so therefore, for me, it took away that judgment of like, I'm doing something wrong by leaving this marriage. And I said, okay, I'm going to make an intentional decision to at least see if my husband has really changed. And he did. And it's been years of us just continuing to work on our marriage to rebuild that foundation on actually something that will hold this time. And so every marriage won't survive infidelity. I don't even advise couples like, oh, I think you should leave. I think you should stay. That is an intensely personal decision that a couple has to come to themselves. But I do believe that if two people are willing to put in the work, and it is a lot of work, if you're willing to put in the work, you're willing to let go of those past relationships that are feeding into this, I do believe that every couple does have a chance at surviving infidelity.
I really love your story though, because what it sounds to me like is that you put yourself at the center and you're like, all right, I'm going to look after myself. I'm going to do what is best for me. And that's really what influenced your relationship between the two of you.
Yeah, I think, and I know that women, especially, a lot of women will overstay in a marriage because of the children. I saw that growing up, where my mom, she should have divorced my stepdad, but she stayed because the children, people think that like, oh, I want to create this perfect family environment. Well, it's not perfect though. It's very dysfunctional and kids are damaged by that. I don't want my sons to grow up thinking that this is how you treat women. I don't want my daughter to grow up thinking this is how a man should treat me. And so I think that while I understand the heart behind it, like why people stayed for the children, that can't be the only reason that you stay, because eventually your children are going to leave the house and you're still going to be stuck there with that person that if you haven't actually rebuilt your marriage aside from your kids, it's going to fall apart anyway.
Thank you so much for sharing this. I'm curious about your friendships and the people around you. Were you sharing your decision-making process with them? Were you getting positive feedback, negative feedback, influence around whether or not you should stay or go? And how much did that play into your decision, if at all?
It did. So I thank God I have just really great friends. And most of my friends were like, Dana, I don't know. I don't know what to tell you. And that's good, because sometimes as friends, we feel like we need to give advice, or and that's not what I was looking for. I just needed empathy. I needed compassion. I needed support. Now, I did have some people around me that thought that they were like supposed to be the voice of God in my life. Like, this is what you need to do. And I had to like kind of step back from some of those folks, even some family members who thought that this is what you need to do and you need to. And so that's not what I needed. I feel like if you are a friend and you see your friend going through something like this, the best thing that you can do is to be a listening ear. If you pray for them. If you want to send them an encouraging song or a quote that you saw online or something like that, great. But really be careful about giving advice as to what you think they should or shouldn't do. Even as a coach, I don't do that because I realize that what worked for me, and I always tell couples, like, this is what worked for us. It might not work for you because I don't know if your husband is going to have the same tenacity, or I don't know if your wife is going to have the same tenacity. I don't know if you will have the same tenacity. So I'm not going to say whether I think you should leave or go. I would think that most of the people in my community for sure wanted to see our marriage restored. They didn't want to see a divorce. They didn't want to see our kids grow up in a one parent household. So even if they didn't say it, I know that the majority of the people in our community were like, I hope you guys can work this out. Please work this out. But yeah, I didn't feel an intense pressure from them to do one thing or another. Thank God.
So I would love to know, now that this is, you said, many years in your past and you've built a stronger, happier, healthier, more thriving relationship since then, what are some of the things that you do now to keep it fueled up?
One of the things is that we really protect our connection. Like, I remember a point where I would ask my husband, like, what is it? Like, what is the thing that keeps driving a wedge between us? And we're busy. We have 4 kids. I have a business. I mean, he has businesses. Like, we are busy people. And so it's easy. Marriage by default, you're not going to stay connected by default. You actually disconnect by default. So you have to be very intentional to protect your connection. That's why I love the fact, your podcast, Date Forever, right? Like, you have to continue to date one another. You have to continue to connect. It's not going to happen just because you have good intentions. You have to be intentional. And so now when I notice anything, like, we haven't really had like a real good, meaningful conversation in a while, I will initiate that conversation. Or if it's been like days and we haven't had sex, hey, like, we need to like get this thing together, because it's those little moments of disconnection. And over time, and kids, you know what, we love our kids, but like, kids can be that disconnecting factor as well, because it's like, I got to run off with this kid and take this kid to practice. And before you know it, your life revolves around your children. And then you realize, oh shoot, like, I haven't had an actual conversation with my spouse in months. So I think that's the biggest thing that we do now, is we're really intentional about protecting that connection. And then the other thing is just being really honest with each other about our needs and our expectations, because a lot of times we assume that our spouse partner knows what we need, but we haven't actually told them what we need, and our needs change. So what I needed at 19 is not what I need at 41, the age that I'm in, the age that I'm at today. I don't need the same things. So, but my husband doesn't know that unless I tell him. I can't assume that he knows that. So and we're not perfect at this by far, but we are really much more intentional about saying, hey, I'm really feeling, my husband told me, like, I feel like you're working too much. I need time with you. Now, if I'm wise, I will hear that and say, okay, I need to change my schedule. I need to maybe back off some things. Or I can be like, well, I need to get these things done. I have a business to run. And that's what unfortunately happens sometimes in marriage. Even when our spouses do tell us what they need, we're not always receptive to actually changing or adjusting things on our end to meet those needs. So therefore, you then make your marriage vulnerable to somebody else coming in and being like, oh, I can help meet that need for you.
Yeah. I really appreciate you sharing that. And I think something that Nathan and I struggled with 2020, 21, where we spent a very large portion of those 24 months in government mandated lockdown. Like, we were in each other's company a lot. And that didn't necessarily mean that we were connecting. And I think there's a real difference between like time in each other's presence, quality time, and then time that drives connection. So for us, one of the best things that we can do is we have far better conversations, more meaningful conversations, more insightful, interesting conversations outside of our home, whether or not that's going for a walk together, sitting at a cafe or a restaurant, or taking a hike or something like that. And that it's amazing that we can be like in each other's presence in one container, in one environment, and you change the container or the environment and we can go to a whole other level. And I think for us, like, we didn't just intuitively know that, we had to learn that. And sometimes for us, like, going for the cheeky weeknight dinner out is an investment in that conversation far more than it is about the food or the convenience or that sort of thing, because we really do have better conversations and therefore deeper connection. And then it makes everything else in my life far easier when my relationship is rock solid.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's really good.
Yeah. Hey, so thank you so much for joining us and sharing a little bit about your story to becoming a coach and your own story in your own marriage and how you've overcome some things. Is there one final thing that you'd like to share or recommend for couples to watch, read, listen, do, especially if they're in that early stage?
I think something I've really been thinking about lately, especially with my clients, is I absolutely believe that people should get outside help. Read the books, listen to the podcast, watch whatever you need to watch. But the best person who can teach you about your relationship is your partner. Listen to your partner. Pay attention to what they're saying to you. Pay attention to what they're not saying. Like, study your partner. And I'm learning this in my own marriage, 23 years in. I'm like, I need to study my husband and learn about him and learn how his experience with me is. And so that would probably be my final takeaway, is like, really get really intense about learning your partner. What makes them happy? What makes them thrive? What are their weaknesses? What are their strengths? How can you be of support to them? Like, so often we're about like me, 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 me. This is what I need. I've got this. But like, if you can turn it around and really like, how can I serve my spouse, my partner better? How can I actually love them better? How can I get to know them better? Then it just puts the relationship in a whole different light. And so that will be kind of my takeaway, is to just be a good student of your partner.
Yeah, I love that. And I think one of the keys to being that great student, though, is to not ever thinking that you've got to an end state of like, I now know them and everything's always going to be the same, because people grow and people evolve and people change. And so I think it's that lifelong learning of your partner and continually being curious about things that are changing or what they're feeling and what's working for them now.
Absolutely.
I get so excited when Nate tells me a story he's never told me before. I'm like, I've never heard you talk about that before. I didn't know that. I just get genuinely excited. Like, oh my gosh, I've just uncovered this whole other thing about this person that I've now spent like, I don't know, 15 years with.
Yeah.
Like, that's cool. And
Yes.
I'm sure that there's, as much as I know, there's probably that much again to learn. So I love that idea of nurturing and cultivating curiosity in your relationship. Yeah. Dana Shay, thank you so much for joining us. To say thank you, we have provided a student in Indonesia with a week of classroom education. So thank you so much for being here and making that possible.
Absolutely. Thank you, guys. This has been great.
Oh, no worries. So, Dana, if people want to connect with you or learn a little bit more about what you do, how can they do that?
The best places to go is my website, which is danashay.com. That's DANACHE.com. Or they can go to realrelationshiptalk.com. That's where I house the podcast. You can listen to the podcast, Real Relationship Talk, on everywhere podcasts are played. I'm on all the social channels. Instagram is where I hang out the most. And so I think they're funny reels that I do on Instagram. So if people want to follow me there, it's I'm at Mrs. Dana Shay, MRSDANACHE on Instagram.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks heaps for joining us. If you love what we're doing here and want more, subscribe to the Date Forever podcast to make sure you never miss an ep. Come and hang out with us and other awesome couples who are fueling up their relationships in the Thriving Couples Collective Facebook group, or check us out at fuelcollective.com.au. Until next time, keep on dating, because better relationships equal a better world.